Now, the talk, as Cathrin said, is based on my book, which was out a bit less than a year ago in November last year with basic books. So if you like the talk, please read the book. You will find most of there. Even if you don't like the talk, I hope you still read the book. At best, it will convince you that I'm right despite the book, or despite the talk. At worst, you will have more reasons to dislike what I say. And the book is here, as you see. And if you think that this title, that this cover is macabre, you should, that's the British one, you should see the US one. But I think they also both, I think the cover also conveys pretty well what I try to figure out in this book. The working title as I wrote the book was To Kill Ukraine. Eventually the editor decided that it sounds too much like a do-it-yourself project and killed it. But even this title, Intent to Destroy, I think it conveys pretty well what I tried to explain in this book, or how I came to this book, trying to understand Russian violence in Ukraine, both the country and the people. Because I started the book as an attempt to understand something that, at least at the beginning of the war, in the first month of the war, did not make any sense to me. If you follow the news about the war, and I assume you do because otherwise you wouldn't be here, then you probably know that violence against civilians is a key feature of how Russia fights this war. And we can talk a lot about how this violence looks like: Bucha, Mariupol, mass execution, sexual violence, even some more gruesome stuff like beheadings, impaling heads on sticks, castrating live POWs with box cutters, etc., etc., etc. And this violence is a puzzle if you go to Russian official narrative of the war, especially in the early months, that the invasion is essentially a war of liberation. That is a war to liberate long-suffering and oppressed Ukrainians, especially Russian-speaker in Ukraine, who are being repressed and mistreated by the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. Now, I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist by training, but I still know enough about war to tell you that true, genuine liberation typically does not involve mass executions of the people you are liberating. So that's how I came to this book, and that's why I initially tried to explain what was going on here. But as I started reading more and writing, I realized that I cannot explain what was going on by starting in February 2022, and not even in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, as most books on the war do. I had to go back in time until I figured out what was going on and until I could present a coherent story, but in the process it also became a historical narrative that covers the last 200 years or so. I do talk about the current war and the violence against civilians in the book, and of course I will be more than happy to talk about that during the Q&A, but the focus of the book itself shifted from trying to explain the current war to a bigger picture of Russian-Ukrainian relations and how, over the last 200 years, Russian imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet governments, and here I use those kind of interchangeably as Russian, even when I talk about Soviet authorities, how they did all they could to control and dominate the area that is now Ukraine and people who live there. Not just ethnic Ukrainians, of course, the area is extremely diverse, and minorities turned out played a huge role in this story. In other words, how from dominating Ukraine, the Russian and Soviet policies regularly shifted to an attempt to kill Ukraine as an idea, a language, an identity, and on some occasions as people. But, before I talk about what I found, what my argument is, since, I'm a professor, and since, after all, we're being sponsored by a university, let's do a short quiz. So I don't have any slides here, but what I will do right now, I will give you 3 sentences, 3 quotes, and you will tell me how many of them belong to Putin. And if not all 3, then how many and which one? So, quote number 1. Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. Quote number 2. Ukrainians are Russian brothers who are being freed and liberated. Quote number 3. Military action is needed to protect brothers of the same blood, Ukrainians. So, how many of those phrases were said by Vladimir Putin? 1, 2, 3. Come on, your guess is 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Actually, just one. Just the first one. The first one is from Putin's article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where he laid out from summer 2021, where he laid out his views on the Ukrainian question and essentially told us openly what he is going to do, and we all said no, he doesn't really mean it. What are the other two? Well, they also come from Russian leaders. So the second one about Ukrainians being Russian brothers who are being freed, it's Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army in 1914, just before the Russian army invaded what was back then the Austro-Hungarian regions of Galicia and Bukovina. And the third quote about protecting brothers of the same blood Ukrainians, it's Vyacheslav Molotov of the Molotov-Ribbentrop fame, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs, justifying the Soviet invasion of Poland on September 1739, when Hitler and Stalin decided to divide Europe. So what we have here are three different leaders, Imperial Soviet and the current post-Soviet autocrat, using pretty much an identical language to justify very similar policies, and unless you really deep into this history, you wouldn't know how many of those things were said by Putin, because they're pretty much the same. So that's another thing that I'm trying to understand. What exactly drives those continuities over time? Regimes change, states collapse, but the language, the rhetoric, and eventually the actions as well remain quite similar. So then, let's get to the real stuff. And what I argue in this book, that in a nutshell, over the last 200 years, with some brief exceptions and interruptions in 1920s and 1990s, controlling and dominating Ukraine was the key goal of Russian Imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet governments. And this desire to dominate Ukraine, I think, can be quite reasonably described as an obsession with Ukraine. Russians are absolutely obsessed with Ukraine, and this obsession is driven by two factors: identity and security. There is a lot of debate in Western media, and especially in my own discipline, in political science, especially in international relations, whether it's security and NATO, or whether it's empire, or whether it's nationalism. Well, it's actually a bit of all, though identity is far more important than security. But let's unpack what I'm talking about when it comes to identity. Well, in a nutshell, for most Russians, being Russian implies a sense of ownership of at least part of Ukraine physically, and most of Ukrainian history. And this identity-based view rests on three components. First is that Russia and Ukraine both trace their history to the same place, Kievan Rus. By the way, Russians no longer call it Kievan Rus, they call it Ancient Rus, just to avoid saying Kiev out loud. A medieval Slavic state that encompassed most of modern Ukraine, Western Russia, Belarus. And then in the 30th century, the state is destroyed by the Mongols. The territory that is now Ukraine quickly goes to Poland and Lithuania, while Moscow emerges from a pretty small, insignificant principality as a large, powerful, very successful, very ambitious, very dynamic state that believes that it has a natural right to dominate all those and control all those lands that used to be Kiev. And was essentially Moscow is a successor of Kiev, which is actually not surprising a story. Quite a few states have those origin stories. The problem becomes when you realize that Kiev is not some mythical city that existed a long time ago. It's also a capital of a completely different country. A second view, or a second key pillar of this Russian obsession and identity view, is that the Russian nation or Russian people consist of three branches. Great Russians, that's the Russians; Little Russians, that's Ukrainians; and the White Russians, Belarusians. The term Great and Little Russians also imply hierarchical relationship. It wasn't always this way. Originally, it was meant simply as geographic terms. But once you start using the language of great and little, it has to evolve into hierarchical relationship. And that's exactly what it did. So essentially, a lot of Russian reactions to what Ukraine does simply boils down to who you think you are and how dare you do something without asking us first. And third, the idea is that all those three branches have just one language for literature, science, poetry, administration, and that's of course Russian. Ukrainian and also Belarusian are just regional peasant dialects that do not deserve their own literature or educational space. In fact, using Ukrainian for all those purposes will be simply a waste of money, resources, and brain power. Now, most people who know anything about Russia and Ukraine are, of course, aware of all those things. They're everywhere in the Russian psyche, in the Russian historiography, in the Russian public sphere, to the extent that they trickled over to Western perceptions of Ukraine, where people use Russia and Ukraine interchangeably or talk about Ukrainians and Russians. What most people do not realize is how recent and modern those ideas are. They're not some, primordial creation myths that are with the Russians for centuries. They're in fact products of the mid-19th century. They're about 200 years old, and that's essentially what I'm describing in this book, how those ideas started and how they came to dominate Russian perceptions of Ukrainians and Ukraine. Where do they come from? And that's where the security part starts kicking in. Well, they come from the partitions of Poland and the fight between the imperial government in St. Petersburg and the Polish independent movement. Because when Austria, Prussia, and the Russian Empire divided Poland, most of contemporary Ukraine went to the Romanov Empire, but with that territory also came the nobility and the urban middle classes that were predominantly Polish and Catholic and fought bitterly for their independence and resurrection of the Polish state. The Russian government had to deal with very large-scale, very bloody uprisings in 1830, 1831, and then in 1860s. And the Russian fear was that if those elites and educated urban middle classes, Catholic Polish middle classes, will be allowed to operate unopposed, they will, quote unquote, corrupt the Ukrainian peasants and, God forbid, convince them to convert to Catholicism, to convince them to switch to speaking Polish, and make them believe that they're not little Russians, but actually Poles. So from the 1830s, the Russian government starts a very coordinated, very large-scale campaign to emphasize how Russian the region is. First little Russian, but then in 1860s, it turns into a campaign of forced Russification, where people in the region are forced to switch to Russian, are forced to start thinking about themselves as Russian without adjectives, and that's again how the security starts trickling into the identity. But more importantly, when we talk about security, there are two types of security. There is the national security and there is the regime security. When people in the West, and unfortunately quite a few in Europe as well, especially in the German-speaking countries such as Austria, talk about the origins of the war, they talk about security. They typically talk about NATO and threats to Russian national security. Those do exist. We know that Russian elites are historically obsessed with national security, and Ukraine, well, there is a wonderful history of Ukraine by Harvard historian Sergei Plokhy with the title The Gates of Europe, because essentially that's what Ukraine is. And gates occasionally open both ways. And that's also the story of Ukraine. So historically, most of Western invasion of Russia came from and through Ukraine. There are natural borders between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, the Carpathian Mountains, the Pripyat marshes. But once you pass those, it's pretty much an open steppe up until China. So Russians are, and for good reason, obsessed with national security, but from what I discovered, national security actually plays a very minor role in their thinking. The security that they are mostly thinking about is the regime security, because nothing scares a Russian autocrat, and Russia historically is mostly an autocracy, than a democratic and free Ukraine, because if those are presumably the same people and Ukrainians manage to build a democracy, then God forbid Russians might want to have the same, and that of course cannot be allowed. Now, it's a self-imposed problem. catch-22 situation, they can get out of this problem quite easily by saying that actually Russians and Ukrainians are different people with different history, different modes of organizing, but that would undermine the identity basis of the regime, so they're stuck with trying to fix a problem that they themselves created, and the only way to fix this problem efficiently is to make sure that Ukrainians do not become democratic. And my final point is that violence and repressions are costly. That's economics and political science 101. So while Russian leadership always had this clear goal of dominating Ukraine and controlling Ukraine, they would rather do it on the cheap without spending too many resources. How would they do it? Well, for the last 200 years, they quite efficiently and quite smartly used strategies that they call divide and repress, where they leverage the diversity of Ukraine. Ukraine historically is an exceptionally heterogeneous place. When in the book I started to list the major communities that lived in Ukraine, the list went to about 3 lines of text. From the large ones like Ukrainians and Poles to a much smaller one like the Swedes, for instance. There is a Swedish community in central Ukraine and others. So what the Russian government first in St. Petersburg and Moscow did is to leverage those cleavages where some groups in Ukraine, those who at any given moment in time are perceived as threatening for the regime, would be mercilessly repressed with a lot of violence and a lot of suppression. But at the same time, there would also always be groups in Ukraine that would be elevated, protected, prioritized, and would serve Moscow and St. Petersburg as their agents on the ground, providing administration, foot soldiers, local knowledge. So every time there would be groups that would do Moscow's and St. Petersburg bidding on the ground. Who those groups are would change over time. Sometimes those would be the traditional Ukrainian Cossack elites, sometimes those would be the Russian-speaking urban working class, sometimes those would be the minorities, such as the Jews. The point is that at every given moment in time, there would be groups in Ukraine that would be repressed, but also there would be groups in Ukraine that would be protected, safe, and pretty content and happy with being ruled from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And those factors, identity and security, especially regime security, were also present in 2022. But what, in my view, explains the invasion, the full-scale invasion and the violence that follows, that for the first time in 2022, this divide and repress strategy failed. Why? Because since 2014 and the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, we see essentially for the first time in history an emergence of political, civic Ukrainian identity where which language you speak, or what is your religion, or what is your ethnicity matters less than your commitment to Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian independence. Now, in part, this is a reaction to Russian 2014 aggression and the annexation of Crimea. Even among people who were sympathetic, historically more sympathetic towards Russia, many of them were genuinely deeply offended by the lies and the propaganda and the brazenness of Crimea. In part, it's just inertia and the natural reaction to independence. Because Ukraine is an independent state for 45 plus years now. So people who are leading the fight for independent Ukraine, well, they do not know any other state. I mean, Zelensky and I were born the same year. For our generation, Soviet Union is not putting a man into space, it's breadlines and economic collapse. Our generation feels zero nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And people who are, and younger people, they were born in independent Ukraine, they simply do not know any other country and do not want to live in Russia. Now, of course, I do not want to say that suddenly, all Ukrainians became liberals and Democrats, or there are no pro-Russian and pro-Putin people in Ukraine. Of course there are. Of course they do exist, and of course old cleavages, such as regional or religious or linguistic cleavages, they did not disappear completely, but they're still less important than the basic commitment to independent Ukraine, because the alternative is being a citizen of Russia with all the corruption and repression and the lack of rights that come with it. And Putin probably would not have invaded if he could control Ukraine peacefully, a la Belarus, or with some client president such as Yanukovych, but it was simply impossible given how how Ukrainian society developed. So for him, the only way to impose this control of Ukraine was through violence. And I think this story also explains the violence against civilians that we see, because we still don't know that much about what was going on in the heads of Russian soldiers who invaded Ukraine, but we know enough to say that many of them actually genuinely believed those identity stories about Ukrainians being Russian brothers who are being liberated. And once they came to Ukraine and realized that those people do not want to be liberated and fight back, the perception of Ukrainians switch from brothers to not even enemies, worse than enemies, traitors. And the violence that follows is essentially a violence of revenge. Now, how those stories, or how those, this combination of identity and security works in practice. In the book, I talk about several episodes in the 19th and 20th century. Today, I want to talk briefly about one which I really love. It's honestly not very much known, even in Ukraine itself, and there is no better place to talk about it than Vienna, and that the Russian occupation of Austro-Hungarian Galicia and Bukovina in 1914, 1915. So what was going on there? After the partition of Poland, Galicia was essentially the only part of the old Kiev and Rus areas that remained outside of Russian imperial control. It went to the Habsburgs, and there was also a substantial Ukrainian community in Bukovina. Now both regions are, of course, the westernmost parts of Ukraine. That's also the area where I come from. And unlike in the Russian Empire, where the language and the Ukrainian political activism and the Ukrainian identity were actively and quite violently suppressed, the Habsburg Empire, as you probably know, worked differently. There, Ukrainians had political rights, they had their educational system, their clubs, to the extent that all Ukrainian activists who felt and were persecuted in the Russian Empire simply moved to Galicia and continued operating from there. The best example is Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, essentially the founding father of the Ukrainian national movement and the first president of independent Ukraine after World War I. He was a Russian subject, but he spent most of his career as a professor of Ukrainian history in Lviv at Lemberg University. And he was not the only one. There was also a brisk contraband of Ukrainian language publications from Galicia to Russian Ukraine, and from the Russian perspective, it was a mortal danger, not just for the regime, but to the empire itself. Why? Because they knew the math. And the math was absolutely brutal. If people in Ukraine, meaning Orthodox Slavs in Ukraine were Little Russians, then together Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians were about 65–66% of the empire's population, so a solid majority. If those people in Ukraine decided they are not Little Russians but something else, namely Ukrainians, the percentage of Russians in their own empire goes to about 44%. In other words, they become a minority in their own state. It might have mattered less in the 19th century, where the empire operated on the divine right of kings, but in the first half of the 20th century, when Russia had its first parliament and parties and elections, it was seen as a mortal threat for the empire and the very existence of the Russian nation, so it had to be suppressed by any means possible. What the Russian Empire did in response? Well, it did two things. First, they started cultivating and finding local pro-Russian activists in Galicia. And back then, you could read the documents, you could read the correspondence from Lemberg and Chernovitz back to Vienna. There were people literally screaming from the rooftops. It's a danger. They're now finding those people, and then at some point they will say that those people are persecuted and threatened, and they will invade to protect them. Which, of course, exactly what happened in 2014 and 2022. And the second prong of the Russian response was to present the Ukrainian identity as some Western, in this case, Austrian plot to destroy Russia. And you need to read those stuff to believe it, but there was a very serious argument going on around St. Petersburg and government and nationalist circles that the very idea of Ukrainian identity is a conspiracy by the Austrian military intelligence. That there are people sitting in this city in the general staff of the Austrian military, and that their job is to create the Ukrainian nation. And they're also helped from Berlin, of course, and all funded by the Jews, because you can't exclude the Jews from those stories. If you look at the current Russian propaganda, the story is the same. Ukrainian identity is a Western plot to destroy Russia. It's just instead of Vienna and Berlin, now it's London and Washington. So, and just generally, there is a common perception that World War I started because of the Russian and also Hungarian competition and conflicts over Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina. In fact, the more we look into the Russian archives and their way of thinking, for them, the issue of Galicia and Ukraine was much more important and much more powerful trigger to go to war than all the Balkans combined, because Balkans were far away. Balkans were a pet project of some Slavophiles, but Ukraine and Galicia was about the survival of the empire itself. So let's get quickly to the war, because I don't have that much time. The war starts in summer 2014, and I already showed you the quote from Grand Duke Nicholas, the commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces. The Emperor Nicholas II himself spoke that there is no Galicia, there is just one great Russia up to Carpathian Mountains, that those people need to be liberated, and of course nobody cared whether those people want to be liberated or not. Russian state decided that they are Russians and nothing else mattered, even though Ukrainians in Galicia were extremely loyal to the Habsburgs because they knew what the alternative is. The war, as you know, doesn't go that well for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to put it mildly, and by September 1914, Russian troops control most of Galicia and Bukovina, with some tiny slices that are still under Austrian control. And the Russian government is very explicit. Their goal is annexation. That's what they're after. In fact, they don't even want to wait until the war is over. There are discussions going on, should we or should we not annex those regions right away as the war going on. Eventually they decided that it would be better off to wait with the formal annexation, with the de jure annexation until the war is over, but de facto those areas would be governed as if they are part of Russia. Now, what being a part of Russia actually means? Well, it means several things. First, it means a huge, massive wave of violence against civilians. Mostly Jews, but not only, with hundreds of thousands of people being uprooted and escaping. You know, in Vienna, people still remember the refugee crisis and the food shortages during World War I. Well, most of this refugee crisis are Austrian citizens escaping or being expelled from Galicia, running away from the Russian violence. What it also means, being governed as if it's part of Russia, is a lot of looting. Everything that can be stolen is being stolen. You know, luxury items, clothes, bedsheets, you name it. The most bizarre case, or the most that I came across, was in Chernovitz, where a Russian cavalry unit destroyed the specimen collection at the local university's zoology department. The Cossacks simply broke the jars in which the specimens were preserved and drank the alcohol. Yeah, I had to share it, sorry. And in addition to this indiscriminate violence, there is also very targeted violence against the Ukrainian elites, activists, intellectuals. So everyone who is seen as a representative of a Ukrainian identity or Ukrainian political classes, including the religious leaders, either killed or wounded or arrested or expelled into Russia itself. Essentially, all the Ukrainian political elites are being decapitated and removed. Instead of them, Russian authorities start promoting local pro-Russians, and more importantly, start importing people from Russia itself to running the region. Because if the region is to be governed as it's Russia, it needs to be governed by Russia. So all the Austrian civil servants are dismissed, or the majority of them. Instead of them, bureaucrats started being brought in from Russia. The laws and the administrative rules are switched from the Austrian one to the Russian ones. The language of administration, the language of the courts, is shifted to Russian, even though almost no one in those regions actually speaks Russian. They changed the name of streets, so no longer no longer Maria Theresa Gass and no longer Franz Ferdinand Platz. They now remained after Russian leaders and Russian cultural figures. They changed the alphabet from Latin to Cyrillic, even though only Ukrainians in the region use Cyrillic. They even switched the time zone to that of St. Petersburg. They also go after Ukrainian language. Everything that is published in Ukrainian is banned. You can't publish anything in Ukrainian, not even calendars or fairy tales. You can't even send mail in Ukrainian. Postal censors are instructed to destroy all correspondence in Ukrainian. German is fine, Romanian fine, French fine, Czech fine. Only two languages are banned, Ukrainian and Yiddish. And they go after the educational system, because if this region is to be Russian, then of course they need to be taught according to the Russian curriculum. All the schools in Galicia and Bukovina are closed. Then Polish and German language schools are allowed to reopen, not the Ukrainian one. Ukrainian education is allowed only at the primary level. Above that, they need to teach in Russian. They need to follow Russian curriculum, and the teachers are now being brought from Russia to teach Ukrainian children that they are Russians. In Galicia, there is also a very active campaign to forcibly convert Ukrainians who are Greek Catholics into Orthodox Church. It doesn't go that well. So the goal, they're very explicit about that. Annexation, Russification, destruction of all features of Ukrainian identity and language. And it's not just the nationalists. For instance, Constitutional Democrats, which is the main liberal party in Russia, they are also fully on board with this idea. Everyone thinks that this region is Russia and needs to be Russian and governed as if it is Russia. And that is quite different from Russian occupation policies elsewhere, such as Eastern Prussia, part of it occupied by the Russian Empire, or the Caucasus. There, the Russian occupation is harsh, repressive, but there is no attempt to completely remake the state. Now, the Russian occupation in Galicia continued up until 1915, and both the Austro-Hungarian and the Russian Empire collapsed, and other things happened during the Great War, so the story is barely known. But if you look at what Russia did during World War I, and if you look at what Russian authorities do right now as we speak in the occupied regions of southern and eastern Ukraine, you will find identical policies almost to the T. And for me, it was an absolutely schizophrenic experience writing in summer 2023, where in the morning I would work with historical documents, with correspondence, with memoirs about what Russian authorities did in Galicia and Bukovina, and in the afternoon I would open the news and see what they're doing in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, and it would be pretty much identical policies. Again, with two exceptions, the date and the place. There are some small exceptions. There are no anti-Jewish pogroms anymore, because simply there are no Jews and there is no major campaign of forced conversion against the Greek Catholics, but there are still attempts, there are still repressions against Catholics and Protestants and churches and the Kiev Patriarchate in the occupied areas, but that would be pretty essentially what Russia does right now in occupied Ukraine would be exactly what they did 100 years ago in Galicia and Bukovina. Now, I'm not saying that anyone in the Kremlin actually knows what the Russian Empire did 100 years ago in Galicia and Bukovina. In fact, I'm pretty sure none of them does, unless they read my book, and I doubt that they did. My point is that they are not simply taking old policies out of retirement. My point is much broader. Because the goals and the ideas and perceptions of what the end point is, or what they want to achieve, is the same. The policies that they adopt are also very similar, even though it's a different state and a different century. Now, I also don't want to create an impression that the story is deterministic and somehow Russian leaders are bound to be obsessed with Ukraine and dominate Ukraine and wear with this story forever. Obsession with Ukraine is a choice, it's not a destiny. And sometimes Russian politicians did make different choices and tried to win themselves of this obsession with Ukraine in 1920s, and even more importantly for my story in 1990s. It failed, both those periods failed, but if we want to have some hope for a better future, we need to understand why they failed and what Russians who did want to build different relations with Ukraine, what they did wrong to fix that. And again, for me, the most important story in the 1990s, Yeltsin's Russia. And both Russia and Ukraine emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union as independent states, and Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, he should be criticized for very many things, but when it came to Ukraine, he instinctively understood that for Russia to become a normal country and to overcome its imperial and communist legacy, Ukraine has to be independent. He was not above pressuring Ukraine economically, but he never questioned Ukraine's existence as a state and its independence, unlike Putin. The majority of the population, on the other hand, did not think that Ukraine is a real state or it should exist in its own border, and we have quite consistent public opinion polling on that throughout the 90s, but they were simply too busy trying to survive. Ukraine was not very high on the day-to-day agenda. There was economic collapse, social crisis. So there was a moment of opportunity to create a different type of relationship, to create a different Russian story of Ukraine and what Russia should do in and about Ukraine. And people who were in charge of the government, Yeltsin and the liberals, they wanted to build Russia that is liberal, peaceful, and not a threat to itself or its neighbors. So their heart was in the right place. The question is, what did they do to build this different story of Russian-Ukrainian relations? Well, the answer is nothing. Why? Not because they were imperialists, but because their thinking about Russia and about the tradition itself was deeply flawed. The vast majority of them were economists. They were thinking about markets. They were thinking about numbers. For them, the solution to all Russia's problem was economic reforms and prosperity. You fix the economy, Russia becomes a prosperous state, and then from this prosperity, democracy and peace and liberalism and all those good things follow. They did not even think about identity. Yeltsin tried a bit. He created a committee to redefine a new Russian national idea, quote unquote. He didn't produce anything. People around him were just too busy with economic reforms. And in that, they, by the way, were quite different from liberal and economic reformers elsewhere, in places like Poland or the Czech Republic, where economic reforms were directly tied to the questions of democracy and identity. Reform to Europe, rebirth, creating a new state, creating a new national story. Russian liberals who were in charge of the state in the 1990s did none of that. And the result was that when instead of prosperity and flourishing economy, market reforms brought misery and poverty, there was absolutely no reason for the average Russian to follow their story and to buy into their vision of this liberal, peaceful Russia. And while the government and the liberal economists were not thinking about identity, the anti-Yeltsin opposition, who were outside of the government, for them that was pretty much the only thing they could talk about. And this opposition, which I like this name, the Red-Brown Alliance, for the red of the communists and the brown of the fascists, they argued about everything. They agreed on only two things. First, they hated democracy. Second, they all believed that Ukraine should be part of Russia, or at least controlled by Russia. Now, here there are several camps. Of course, the communists, the old regime. For them, the goal was to reestablish the Soviet Union. You cannot do it without Ukraine. In fact, the Soviet Union collapsed because Ukraine voted for independence, and they definitely did not want to recreate the Soviet Union with all those Tajikistans and Uzbekistans and Georgias. There is no Soviet Union without Ukraine, so if you want to do it, then bringing Ukraine under Moscow's control is the first necessary step. The conservatives. Here the two most important figures are Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the dissident and the Nobel Prize-winning writer, and Yuri Lushkov, probably the second most powerful politician in the country, the mayor of Moscow. Solzhenitsyn he is revered and idolized in the West for being a dissident and opposing communism and spending time in the Gulag, and that is all correct. He was also a pretty extreme Russian nationalist. He believed that instead of the Soviet Union, there should be a state or unitary state of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, maybe parts of Kazakhstan, especially those where Russians are the majority, and Ukraine should not be independent. But if they're crazy enough to try independence, let them do it, but only in what he called true ethnographic borders, meaning without eastern and southern Ukraine. If Ukraine is independent, those regions should go to Russia. And interestingly, since late 1980s, he was pretty much the only one who seriously spoke about a possible war between Russia and Ukraine and how it might come about. Nobody back then took him seriously. We should have. Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, well, he managed to get himself declared persona non grata in Ukraine for going to Crimea and saying openly that Crimea should go to Russia. After that, he started a major infrastructure project with the Crimean government, a bridge that would connect mainland Russia to Crimea without even consulting the government in Kiev. Of course, when the government got wind of that, they shut down the project, but this bridge was pretty much the first thing that Putin did after annexing Crimea. And so for conservatives, there was no question. Russia should control Ukraine. And there are the radicals, people like Alexander Dugin, a geopolitics guru, who is sometimes called Putin's brain. He is not Putin's brain, but at the same time, whatever Dugin said 20 years ago, now Putin repeats it almost verbatim. And by the way, he was the first one to produce a map of divided Ukraine with eastern and southern part called Novorossiya, long before 2014. And Eduard Limonov, the leader of the National Bolshevik Party, and the National Bolsheviks were absolutely essential in starting the violence in the Donbass. For those people, and that's why it's reasonable to call them radicals, Russia should be a continental empire. And of course, you cannot have a continental empire without Ukraine. In fact, creating this continental empire should start with Ukraine. And interestingly, with an exception of Dugin, none of those people in all those factions, neither the communists, nor the radicals, nor the conservatives, are talking about Russian control in Ukraine in the context of NATO and national security. It's all about history, identity, nationalism. National security and NATO absolutely do not feature in those discussions. And the result was that since the economic vision of the liberals and their political power collapsed, there was absolutely no alternative. Those ideas essentially became mainstream to a degree that even liberals started using this imperial language. So, for instance, Boris Chubais, who was essentially the brain behind economic reform, started talking about Russia's future as a liberal empire. I have no idea what liberal empire is, but I'm going to the UK asking people, maybe they know, they do not, since we are in Vienna, maybe you know, but probably, Habsburg comes the closest. The point is that liberals probably should not be talking about empires, but they do. And for me, the most interesting, we should pass this around. The most interesting case is this image that I'm going to show you. So just pass it around. We don't have slides. I just want you to look at it. So what is it? We know that in around 2007, 2008, everyone in the Kremlin was reading a book with the title The Third Empire, Russia as It Should Be. It was written by a prominent Kremlin insider, a guy named Mikhail Yuriev, who was the vice speaker of the parliament. Interestingly, from a liberal Yabloko party. He is not a crying nationalist. He is a liberal. And what the book is, it hasn't been translated into English. It's actually a horrible book. It's a futuristic novel about the world in 2015. What happens in 2015? The world is divided into 5 empires or state. You see them, you are part of the Russian Empire, alongside with Greenland, by the way, and the UK. Russia is a superpower, it's also a theocratic autocracy. The point is how Russia gets to this point, and just 1 minute, and I'm done. Well, it's easy. Russia defeats the US in a nuclear war with some super weapon that Russian scientists developed. But what even more important for me is how Russian rise to this imperial status begins. And it begins, of course, in Ukraine, and I love the quote, a country that, again, quote unquote, irritated the Kremlin by the very fact of its existence. And the situation is this. The year is 2007, Ukraine is split politically, there is a crisis, there is a pro-Western government in Kiev and pro-Russian factions in the east who start protesting against the government. The protests become violent. The government in Kiev sent riot police and troops to force those protests. The leaders of the protests turned to Moscow for help. Moscow sends troops, threatens NATO not to invade or not to react because there would be a nuclear war, defeats the Ukrainian army. Then there is a referendum, a new state called Novorossiya that is quickly absorbed into Russia, and then several years later, the rest of Ukraine follows. Now, if you know anything about 2014 and 2022, that's pretty much exactly how the story unfolded, to the extent that I know people who believe that actually folks in the Kremlin read it not as a futuristic novel, but as a to-do manual. I wouldn't go that far, but that again, another example of how similar ideas about what Ukraine is and what Russia should do about Ukraine produce quite similar policies over time. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before handing over the microphone to Alexander, it's a good tradition that I start with a few questions to the content.
Can I have a pen, please?
Sure, thank you. Sure. And then later it's going to be your turn. You said that in 2022, the strategy of divide and oppress failed. Why did it take from 2014, Maidan, to 2022 for Putin to decide that he wanted to destroy Ukraine, or eventually had to destroy it because it wouldn't submit?
Okay, so should we go just one by one?
Sure.
Okay, right. So why? So first of all, this. You're right. So the key period is between 2014 and 2022 when Putin realizes that Ukraine is lost for him forever.
Exactly, because Maidan doesn't really feature in your speech.
Yeah, Maidan is not part of the story. What is part of the story is what happens after Maidan, because we see this Ukrainian state becoming much stronger, regional cleavages becoming less important. Over time, there is a thinking in Russia that they can turn Ukraine into Belarus either by having pro-Russian politicians elected in Ukraine. So there was a lot of hope that Zelensky might be one of those people, but it doesn't pan out. So this idea is off the table. There is another strategy of forcing Ukraine to take back Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, Donbass with special powers and essentially veto authority over everything that Kiev does. But this process is also stalled. There is no solution. So essentially, over time, Putin simply runs out of options, and at some point, he probably realizes that all those ideas, all his plans of turning Ukraine into a client state without war or without formal annexation, they're off the table. We don't know when exactly he decided to invade and why. It requires going into Putin's brain. I would rather not do. It's a very dark and scary place. But from what we understand, probably the tipping point was when the Ukrainian government banned 3 channels owned by Medvedchuk, who was Putin's closest ally, and the last Russia's vehicle to influence Ukrainian public opinion.
So you mean he lost leverage?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it just took several years, until the realization that Ukraine is going finally crystallize into.
Second question, besides Maidan, which didn't really feature in your speech, the other thing that didn't feature, I know you couldn't mention everything, but is Holodomor. You were talking about mainly a culture war in the past. Not allowing the language, changing the spelling to Cyrillic, etc., etc. But what was Holodomor? An attempt not to oppress, but to kill, an early one? And how does that fit into your structure?
Right. Okay. So first of all, there is a chapter on the Holodomor in the book, and there is, of course, a chapter on 2014, 2022. Since we're in Vienna, I decided I would rather speak about World War I. So what was Holodomor? So Holodomor was a reaction to one of those very few attempts to allow Ukrainian independent identity, independent within confines of the Soviet state or independent language to exist, and it was seen as a threat by Russian nationalists in Moscow, including Stalin himself, who quickly became a Russian nationalist. And Holodomor was several things into one. We tend to focus on the famine, which was politically motivated, and the famine was essentially an attempt to both distract resources from the peasantry, but also breaking the bones of the Ukrainian peasantry, who were seen as the most nationalist part of the Ukrainian population. Moscow really feared Ukrainian revolts, and for a good reason, because once the collectivization started, were protests with chants, long live independent Ukraine and long live Petlura. Those people remembered the period of Ukrainian independence after World War I. So there was an attempt to break them as a social class. And in parallel with the famine, there is also a concentrated elimination of Ukrainian cultural elites, the so-called executed Renaissance, but it's actually went way beyond the poets and the writers. So everyone who is associated with Ukrainian language, Ukrainian education, Ukrainian identity, even though they're not peasants, are also targeted. So it's two-pronged attacks on everything that is perceived as Ukrainian identity, the peasants and the elites.
Okay, last question for now, then it's your turn. Ivan Krastev, for example, says Putin fights this war not for security or identity, but for demography, because he needs people, because the Russians are dying out. And other scholars say it's not about security and identity, it's about economics. Because what he needs is, the black soil and the industry, which is actually destroying at the moment. So what about demography and economy, which you didn't mention?
Right, I didn't mention because I don't believe they're that important.
Okay.
People, no, I don't believe that the war has a demographic component. Those people are perceived as Russian, but I don't believe that Putin is obsessed with, just increasing the number of people, and if that's the goal, he has other instruments to do it. For instance, liberalizing migration from Central Asia. That would bring even more people. I also don't think it's about economy or the soul. There is a perception of, Ukraine being the breadbasket and Ukrainian soul, and that's true. Ukrainian soil is extremely productive, but it's not the 19th century, and it's not even 1930s anymore. What blows people's mind when they say them? Russia is now the largest grain exporter in the world. Russia controls about 25% of the global grain market.
I think you have to stress it still is.
Still is. If they want to starve most of the Middle East and Southeast Asia, they're more than capable of doing so. They don't need Ukrainian soil. It might be a nice addition, but if you already control 25% of the global market, then the addition of Ukraine would be pretty marginal. And Putin actually is not that much obsessed about economy right now as we think, as it gets older and thinking more about his legacy. His legacy is not economic, his legacy is political.
Okay, so I'm going to save the rest for later. It's your turn. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'll put that over closer.
Well, thanks a lot, Eugene, for coming here. And And thanks for inviting me to give this short comments. I actually spent the last week reading this wonderful book, and I learned a lot. And I should say that this is essentially, it reads like a historical book. It's a book of history, even though Eugene is a political scientist and I am a historian. But I think we kind of swapping these whatever aspects, professions, and I will actually play devil's advocate by saying that history is not truly relevant here. And but what is relevant? That's of course a big question to you, Eugene. And while devil in this context is very clearly, the president of Russia, but I'm not his advocate, because I think that is his position, that history is overwhelmingly relevant. History explains it all. Well, I don't believe so. So I will continue if you don't mind. So, but before I go to my question connected to this, I should say that as a history book, that it's just bursting with wonderful details which I didn't know, and probably you don't know. For instance, that in the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, there were American pilots flying reconnaissance planes. And one of them was Miriam Cooper, who later, in 1933, produced the King Kong movie, which you probably saw in one of its multiple, what's the name, versions of the later remakes. And he was interviewed. So he was shot. His plane was shot, and he was the Russian or Soviet prisoner of war. And he was interviewed by the Soviet Jewish writer Isaac Babel, who interviewed this Miriam Cooper, the future creator of King Kong, which made me think that there was a lively debate in the Soviet studies, mostly produced by American historians who connected the King Kong film. So in King Kong, in case you haven't seen it, that there is a huge gorilla, which is kind of jumping from in New York from one skyscraper to another, and kind of doing all kinds of gorilla things. And in the middle 1930s, the Soviets were planning to build a huge skyscraper in Moscow called the Palace of Soviets, which would feature, according to the blueprints, a gigantic statue of Lenin on the top of the skyscraper. And the blueprints of this Palace of Soviet skyscraper with Lenin on the top look exactly like some kind of the most famous shots of the King Kong film. So King Kong replacing Lenin replacing the King Kong, because that was later. So they probably saw the film. That's kind of funny, really funny thing about that. So Eugene's book struck me as a wonderfully balanced book. It's. I also wrote this book, also, kind of Russia against modernity, and I know how it's difficult to write a balanced book of history and politics during the war. Like the wartime books are never balanced. Your book is an exception, and I really admire it because it's a fantastic achievement. So many things are kind of named there, and Eugene claims that, and that's a serious thing, that Eugene was the first to use the term genocide for what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. So things are named, but they are counterbalanced, I think, but very reserved and very articulate and very human and I would say very globalist, as opposed to sort of nationalist perspective on the key issues, such as what does it mean to be a Ukrainian? Really kind of key issues of the war and of the nation. And I quote, being Ukrainian in a civic political sense is a deliberate choice. This is what Eugene says. And for me, that's the key thesis here, the key point of the book. So it's not the issue of ethnic origins, not the issue of origins at all, not an issue of language or culture, not an issue of history, but it's a political, deliberate choice. And much of what is said later about the relations between security and identity, this is the key explanatory concepts, also follow this logic. So, okay, security, so Russia was so much concerned about security that it started the war, which has become a major challenge to Russian security. And in my perspective, basically Russia would, and exactly the security of both the state of Russia, the country of Russia, and of the current regime, the security would vanish because Russia started this war. Okay, but security, of course, is not something objective. It's like constructed. That's political scientists know how to talk about that. But since it is constructed, that immediately becomes an identity issue. So we're coming back to this kind of security as basically as an issue of identity, while identity is a deliberate choice. It's a political choice that people make according to their political views, interests, education. Education is a key subject in one of the chapters, and I really appreciate that. That's hugely important. And of course, we're all kind of fighting. I will finish very soon. We're all fighting with trying to understand Putin's logic. Like he claimed right before the invasion, right before he pressed the button and the missiles started going, he claimed that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same. Nations, society, peoples. And how does it follow from this that Ukrainians should be killed or exterminated? Under the same people, okay, fine. I mean, there are those who agree or disagree. But what's the logic of that? And basically, there is. I think it's still kind of an issue that hangs in the air. Also because, so Eugene says in the book and repeated here that Ukraine is a very, very diverse, very heterogeneous country. But of course, the Russian Federation is also very, very heterogeneous. It has whatever, people of different religions, ethnicities, races. Hundreds of different peoples. And say, if Putin would say that, say, the Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, he would not say it about the Chechens. Mm-hmm. He would not. He also killed the Chechens, that was also genocide, but he wouldn't say that. He wouldn't say the same about whatever the Buryats, etc., and the Kalmyks, and you name it, like hundreds of other people who are arguably more different from Russians than Ukrainians. So this, whatever, there is a logical chain in the book, in Eugene's book, from this thesis of unity or identity as equivalence to genocide. But whatever this logic is, it could be easily applied also to the Kalmyks, etc., to the Buryats. And I think you, Eugene, still believe in the future of democracy in Russia in its contemporary borders. While I really have hard time understanding how could it happen if Russia would stay in the same borders, from Chechnya to Buryatia to Chukotka. How could it be democratic? We should connect our hopes to something else. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks, Sasha. That's great, and I'm really glad you like the book. Yeah, that means a lot. So several comments. I actually very much. So thank you for liking those small anecdotes and details that you didn't know. Full disclosure, I didn't know them as well before I started writing the book, and writing this book was a bit of a result of arrogance. Where your work, and you mentioned that many people writing books about about the war. So I never tried to write a book about the last 200 years. Essentially, what do I know about 19th century? So I started pitching the book to various editors, and one of them, eventually the one who published the book, said, well, right now everyone, including historians, are writing contemporary stuff. Why don't you write something along your timeline? And I was stupid enough to agree, and that's how I discovered all those details. And by the way, I had 6 months to write all of it and do all the research. I also like that you thought that it's balanced, but honestly, it's balanced because it's a result of overcorrection. I forced myself to be balanced because, as I was writing it, I was burning from within, and everyone knew where I stood politically because I was very active, in the media and elsewhere on what I think. After all, I am from Ukraine. I'm not a citizen of Ukraine. We left, it was still Soviet Union, but that's where my family is from. That's where my friends are. And something that is in the book, it was also my personal revenge story. Because if you go to the acknowledgements, the first line would be thanking people who fight for Ukraine. The second would be thanking the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence. Because I decided to write. Yeah, I see some surprise lines. So for me, it was, I didn't want to write this book. What pushed me to write this book was that when I was still teaching in my current school, but in Washington, I had a student who took several classes with me, worked pretty closely with me, then asked for a recommendation letter for the International Criminal Court. I wrote him the recommendation. He got the job, and when he got to The Hague, he was revealed as an undercover GRU officer. And that happened in 2022, exactly in the middle of it. So that pushed me over the line.
So you felt betrayed.
Sorry?
You felt betrayed.
Well, it's not so, not betrayed, more outrage. So first, outrage, and second, it was personal. It was a Chinese student, and industrial espionage, I would say, part of the job. I teach in an international affairs school in DC. Of course we have those spies, but me, International Criminal Court, and the Russian military, it was a bit over the top. So I decided that, and being a nerd, that's my way to fight back. So I would write a book and then donate the money to Ukraine. So that's how I wrote the book, and I actually worked very hard, not to express what I felt from within. So I'm glad it worked out. On the secure, by the way, this SOB is still in Brazilian jail. On the security as an identity. So there are several, and how you get from the security and identity to mass murder. So several things. I don't think there was a plan for mass murder, and I don't think there was a plan for genocide. Based on what we know, there was a pretty clear plan for a regime change operation where a smallish number of the Ukrainian elites will be killed, imprisoned, exiled, but there would be no Buchas and Mariupols and mass execution. So in fact, Ukraine collapsed during the first couple of days, we would not have gotten to those mass killings. Those mass killings essentially a result of Ukraine resisting and the perception of Ukrainians as bad Russians or even bad Ukrainians. Because if you look at the Russian discourse right now, there are the good Ukrainians who are pro-Russian, and there are the bad Ukrainians who are those fighting against Russia. Those need to be eliminated. It's just before 2022, because they didn't know that much about Ukraine or because they were so high on their own supply of propaganda, they believed that just this number of those bad Russians or bad anti-Russian Ukrainians is simply small and they can't be removed very easily. But once they discovered that actually those people, that essentially the entire country are bad Ukrainians and non-Russians, that's how we moved from those very targeted, very specific kill lists that the FSB prepared for each community to mass execution, Bucha style. But also, genocide is not about numbers. Right? Genocide is, and that's the title of the book, genocide is about intent to destroy a group as such, and that's what we see in the Ukrainian case. It's not about killing as many Ukrainians as possible. It's about destroying Ukrainians as a national group, not as an ethnic group, again. And that actually ties to your point about being Ukrainian is a choice. It's not about ethnicity. It's about being Ukrainian in the political sense. Identifying as Ukrainian, no matter what your religion is, and supporting Ukraine as an independent state, which is not controlled by Russia. To your point about Russian democracy, well, given the stuff that I do in my daily life, I need to be optimistic because otherwise, we're stuck in this cycle forever. I'm actually not, honestly. I would love to see Russia democratic. I don't think for Ukraine is actually that important whether Russia is democratic or not. What is more important is forcing Russia to accept the shift in its perception of Ukraine. And whether an autocratic Russia does it or a democratic one, I honestly don't really care. I will leave to Russians to decide among themselves, as long as they leave Ukraine alone.
Okay, thank you. Alexandra, I want to ask you something. Since you were born in Leningrad, I interviewed Karl Schlögl 2 days ago, who was awarded the Peace Prize in Frankfurt 2 weeks ago, and he said what you would obviously say too, that he never thought that Putin was a guy to be trusted. So he wasn't really amazed about the war and everything that preceded it and followed. But he said what really amazed him was that the Russian people let themselves be dragged into that war, knowing Ukraine, because modern Russians, they didn't only have their vacation on Crimea, but they studied in Kharkiv and they visited Kiev and they know where Odessa is, and they've been traveling Ukraine. So he says what he doesn't understand is that Karl Schlögl, yeah. And, Sorry, I'm not close enough. I'm sorry. So what he says is Putin's intentions were obvious and clear, but how did he get the Russians to fight that war with him?
Well, I think that I fully agree with Karl Schlögl, and he is really a great historian of Russia, possibly the biggest name nowadays in my field. And we're friends, and I'm very proud of it. Of course, I don't know the answer to your question, but I agree with his point that there is no surprise about Putin and the Putinists, but there is a huge surprise about the kind of Russian total passivity and complicity in the events. There is no rebellion, no protest, no resistance, not much of a sabotage. There is a lot of sabotage going on. Refineries, they are burning not only because of the missiles launched from Ukraine, but also because someone is exploding them from inside. But usually when we read this news, we think that they are Ukrainians. We don't. The guerrilla people, the saboteurs, they are Ukrainians, they're not Russian. Thinking about this in Eugene's terms, I would say that if someone like me would say that being Russian is a political choice, being Russian is a political choice. I mean, Russians would, almost no Russian would agree with that. I'm actually...
Русский or российский?
About this, I frankly don't care. It's all kind of historical bullshit. but I deeply believe it is. It is being a Putinist is a political choice. Those who are complicit, they have made their choice. That's choice, nothing but.
Thank you. One last question, then I'll open the floor. We talked about the past a lot now. What I'm really interested in is, you said you don't want to look into Putin's head. I get that. And you said you didn't want to try to understand his logic. I get that too. But what do you think is his plan for the future? Being stuck in that war, which doesn't work out, with 1 million dead soldiers, and not getting anywhere, dragging it out and dragging it on. So does he have a plan for the future of Ukraine? So, a question to both of you.
So, sir, you want to go? Okay. So, I don't know what his plan is. Probably more of the same, and just waiting it out because there is no other choice. So, what? And he still might win. Right? It's not inevitable. It's still possible that Ukraine collapses. So how I'm thinking about it is essentially two sand glasses standing side by side and running out of sand. One is the Ukrainian one, another is the Russian. And the Russian one is a socioeconomic. It's not a military sand clock. He just needs to survive, and the Ukrainian one is a military one. People and material. So essentially what he needs to do is to survive long enough without revolution within Russia until Ukraine runs out of people or until it runs out of material because of Putin or because of other problems in Europe, and he might as well get it.
Yeah, he might as well get it, but unless because of the Ukrainian military success, but also because of the Western sanctions, Russia would suffer so much that there will be a revolution in Russia. And I think that's one of the very probable, not the only possible, but one of the probable outcomes of the war. And what kind of revolution that would be? That would be an ethnic rebellion of the Tatars, Bashkirs, Kalmyks, etc., which would lead to disintegration of the Russian Federation. And in this case, democracy would be a choice for certain, not for all, but for some new independent countries of Russia. Eugene doesn't believe in this script. I know it from his conclusion.
No, it's not that I don't believe it. I actually think that Russian collapse from within is possible. I mean, it happened before. It happened in 1917. Happened in 1989. It's not that Russia is invincible, but if history is teaching me anything, is that if this is going to happen, it won't be because of the periphery and the borders. It will be more because of the economic and social problems at home. Because Russian Empire collapsed not because it was defeated on the battlefield, it was because it ran out of bread. Soviet Union, and you remember it as well as I, collapsed because we simply did not have enough food to go around. And, with the sanctions and the economic situation, it might as well happen. So for the regime, the key is to make sure that, Moscow and St. Petersburg and Nizhny and, some other large cities have enough food to go around. And they're safe, but when that stops happening, then they will be in deep trouble.